They made a critical mistake when they decided to mess with me. The morning I looked most powerless, standing in my boxers at 6 a.m., watching 3 squad cars surround my ranch, was actually the moment I became unstoppable. See, Patricia Thornfield thought she'd finally broken the stubborn rancher with her $24,000 in fake fines and her army of city inspectors. What this HOA president didn't know was that I'm a retired Army Corps engineer who spent 20 years solving impossible problems. While she was busy playing neighborhood dictator, I was quietly building a case that would cost her everything: her freedom, her stolen $180,000, and her precious white Lexus. Here's the beautiful part. My 47-acre ranch was never even in her HOA. Granddad's land predates their subdivision by 34 years. What would you do if someone tried to steal your family's legacy with fraudulent paperwork? Drop your reaction below. I'm betting half of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Trust me, what happens next will make your day. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm 42, and after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, all I wanted was some peace and quiet on the land my grandfather left me. This isn't some suburban cookie-cutter lot. We're talking about a 47-acre working ranch in unincorporated Williamson County, Texas, complete with rolling hills, century-old live oaks, and limestone fence posts my grandfather built by hand back in 1952. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of meadowlarks calling across the pasture, the distant lowing of my neighbor's cattle mixing with the scent of cedar posts and morning dew on native grass. I'd run my hand along those smooth oak gate latches Granddad installed, feeling the rough texture of limestone he'd quarried himself. This place had soul, something you can't buy in a subdivision. After a messy divorce and 2 decades of military precision, I was finally ready to slow down. I started a small excavation and land clearing business. Nothing fancy, just me and some equipment helping neighbors with ponds and driveways. Honest work that paid the bills and kept me outdoors. That's when I met Patricia, Patty Thornfield. Picture this: 58 years old, perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, driving a white Lexus SUV so spotless you could perform surgery on the hood. Patty had moved here from California about 5 years ago with her husband, some mid-level city bureaucrat, and had promptly appointed herself the neighborhood's aesthetic police chief. See, Patty was the HOA president of Sunset Ridge, a development that sprouted up in the late 80s about a quarter mile from my property line. For 8 years running, she'd been elected unopposed, mostly because nobody else wanted the headache. But Patty lived for this stuff. She had a reputation for targeting what she called undesirable properties, and if you read between the lines, you'd notice those properties usually belonged to folks who didn't fit her country club crowd. The first shot, fired in what would become my personal World War II, landed on my gate one Thursday morning in March, an official-looking citation printed on fancy letterhead. Violation of CCNR 4.73, unsightly agricultural equipment. Attached were color photographs of my grandfather's 1962 Ford tractor, a machine that still ran like a Swiss watch and had more character than Patty's entire subdivision. The fine, $150, escalating by $50 per day until the violation was corrected. The contact information led straight to Patricia Thornfield, Architectural Compliance Officer. Now, I'm a reasonable man. My first instinct wasn't to go nuclear. It was to pick up the phone and politely explain the situation. "Ma'am," I said when she answered, "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." "The mistake," she snapped, "is thinking you can run a junkyard next to our community." Before I could explain that I wasn't legally part of her community, she hung up. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with someone interested in reason. A week later, citation number 2 arrived. Violation of CCNR 211, livestock. The photograph showed my 3 horses, Ranger, Belle, and Dakota, grazing peacefully in a pasture where horses had grazed for 70 years. This time, the fine jumped to $3,000, and there was a threat attached: legal action and law enforcement involvement. Will follow continued non-compliance. I sat on my porch holding that citation while the evening breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of whip-poor wills starting their nightly chorus. This woman was declaring war on everything my family had built here. The problem was, Patty Thornfield had no idea who she was messing with. She saw an isolated rancher she could bully into submission. What she didn't see was a man with 2 decades of military problem-solving experience, an engineering degree, and zero tolerance for petty tyrants. It was time to educate Mrs. Thornfield on the difference between authority and power, but Patty wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting warmed up. Citation number 3 arrived that Monday. Violation of CCNR 842, unsightly structures. This time, she'd photographed my grandfather's hand-built barn from 1954, a structure that had weathered 7 decades of Texas storms and still stood straighter than most of the McMansions in her subdivision. Then came citation number 4, violation of CCNR 5177, improper signage. My crime? A modest wooden sign at my gate reading Morrison Land Clearing, licensed and insured in simple black letters. The same sign that had been there for 3 years without a single complaint. I started noticing that white Lexus cruising past my property every morning around 7 a.m. and every evening around 6 p.m. She wasn't even subtle about it, windows down, phone in hand, snapping pictures like some suburban paparazzo. One morning, I caught her actually measuring my fence line with a tape measure, wearing designer jeans and hiking boots that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. That's when I decided to do what I should have done from the start, actual research. The next morning, I drove to the Williamson County Clerk's office and pulled every property record, survey map, and deed going back to 1950. Here's what I found. And this is something every property owner needs to know. You can't retroactively include property in an HOA. Period. The law is crystal clear. My land was deeded to my grandfather in 1952. The Sunset Ridge HOA was formed in 1987, 35 years later. According to the original HOA plat maps, my property was specifically excluded from their boundaries. In legal terms, Patty had about as much authority over my land as she did over the moon. Armed with a manila folder full of documentation, I called Mrs. Thornfield again. This time I was ready. Mrs. Thornfield, this is Jake Morrison. I have the original survey maps from the county clerk's office, and I think we need to clear up this misunderstanding. I don't care what your little papers say, she interrupted. This neighborhood has standards, and you're bringing down everyone's property values with that eyesore of a ranch. Ma'am, I said evenly, with all due respect, I'm not in your neighborhood. I'm not in your HOA. My property predates your development by 3 decades. We'll see about that, she snapped, hanging up again. The woman had the social skills of a cactus, but I had to admit she was persistent. The next morning, I found out just how persistent. When I stepped outside to feed the horses, I noticed fresh survey stakes hammered into my land, bright orange markers with red ribbons fluttering in the breeze. Someone had spray-painted lines across my oak trees, outlining what looked like a new boundary that conveniently included about 5 acres of my property. Inside the HOA's territory, I followed the trail of stakes and paint like breadcrumbs, through a fairy tale. Except this one was about property theft, not magic, and it starred a woman who thought she could redraw county lines with a can of Krylon. The metallic ping of those stakes being driven into the ground still echoes in my head. The sharp scent of spray paint mixed with the morning air, a jarring contrast. Industrial chemicals scarring God's country. Those smooth, cold stakes pressed against the rough bark of trees that had stood there since before Patty was even born. Here's the little twist that changed everything. I had security cameras. After my divorce, I'd installed a basic surveillance system. Not fancy, just enough to keep an eye on my equipment and make sure no one messed with the horses. Those cameras caught everything. The white Lexus pulling up at 5:47 a.m., Patty stepping out with a hammer and a bag of survey stakes, and spending the next hour pretending to be a property developer on land that wasn't hers. I pulled every single stake out of the ground and stored them in my workshop as evidence. but I left the spray-painted marks on the trees. I wanted to see how far she'd take it. Turns out pretty far. 2 days later, my phone rang. "Mr. Morrison, this is Deputy Rodriguez with the Williamson County Sheriff's Office. We've received a complaint about destruction of official survey markers on HOA property. I need to come out and talk to you." And that, folks, was Patty Thornfield's first major tactical error. She had just filed a false police report, claiming I destroyed official markers she'd illegally placed on my land. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and she had no idea what she'd stepped in. When Deputy Rodriguez pulled up my driveway 30 minutes later, I was ready, not to fight, but to educate. There's a difference, and that difference would save my bacon and cost Patty dearly. "Mr. Morrison," the deputy said, stepping out of his patrol car, "we've received a complaint about destruction of HOA property, something about survey markers." "Deputy, I appreciate you coming out," I replied. "But before we go any further, I think you need to understand the legal situation we're dealing with." I handed him my manila folder, the same one I'd tried to show Patty. Inside were property records, original survey maps, and deed documentation going back 70 years. Rodriguez was a pro. He took his time, scanning every page. After about 10 minutes, he looked up. "Sir, according to these documents, your property was never part of the HOA." "That's correct," I said. "And those survey markers Mrs. Thornfield claims I destroyed? They're in my workshop. She placed them there at 5:47 a.m. last Tuesday. I've got the footage to prove it. Now, here's something worth remembering. Filing a false police report in Texas is a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 180 days in jail and a $2,000 fine. Deputy Rodriguez reminded me of that as we walked toward my workshop to inspect the evidence. "These aren't official survey stakes," he said, examining the orange plastic markers. "They're the kind you buy at Home Depot for $20. Official boundary surveys require licensed surveyors and county approval." I showed him the footage on my phone. Patty, clear as day, trespassing and planting fake survey stakes. The deputy shook his head, made a few notes, and said, "Mr. Morrison, it seems like you're the victim here, not the perpetrator. I'll need to file a report on the false complaint, but I don't see any crime on your part." As he was leaving, he paused with a grin. "You know, my cousin Luis needs some land cleared for a pond project. You still doing that kind of work?" "Tell him to call," I said. "Though apparently the neighborhood watch thinks I'm not allowed to own work equipment." Rodriguez chuckled. "That lady sure seems determined. Good luck, sir." But Patty wasn't finished making my life interesting. She was just getting started on what I now realize was a systematic campaign to drive me off my own land. 3 days after the deputy's visit, I got a call from a city inspector. "Mr. Morrison, this is David Chin with the City Planning Department. We've received an anonymous complaint about potential zoning violations on your property. I need to schedule an inspection." The timing was suspicious, but I had nothing to hide. "Come on out," I told him. "How's tomorrow morning?" Now, here's where Patty's husband's city job became relevant. Suddenly, I was getting anonymous complaints from multiple departments. Code enforcement wanted to inspect my septic system. The fire department needed to verify burn permits, and environmental services had questions about water runoff. It was like watching a coordinated attack unfold, and the coordination was coming from inside City Hall. But here's the thing about military training. It teaches you to prepare for everything. My property was cleaner and more compliant than most suburban developments. Every permit was current, every system maintained, every piece of equipment registered and insured. Inspector Chen arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. Within 5 minutes, I could tell he was a good guy just doing his job. He spent 2 hours inspecting every inch of the property and found exactly 0 violations. "Mr. Morrison," he said, closing his clipboard, "I've been doing this 15 years. Your operations textbook perfect. Whoever filed this complaint was either mistaken or—" He hesitated diplomatically. "Or had other motives," I finished for him. "Between you and me," he said quietly, "that HOA lady calls our office about 3 times a week. Different complaints, same property. We're starting to notice a pattern." That's when I realized the scale of what I was dealing with. So I did what any good engineer does when faced with a complex problem. I gathered data. Over the next week, I dug through public records, and what I found made my blood boil. Patty hadn't just targeted me. Over the past 2 years, she'd filed complaints against half the neighborhood. The Ramirez family, Hispanic, Lot 12, accused of overcrowding for housing 3 generations under one roof. Sarah Mitchell, single mother, Lot 8, reported for running an automotive repair business because her teenage son was fixing an old Honda. Bill Thompson, an elderly Vietnam vet, 6 reports claiming his RV was vagrant camping. The pattern was undeniable. Patty was systematically harassing anyone who didn't fit her suburban ideal and using city resources to do it. But this time, she'd made a critical mistake. She picked a fight with someone who knew how to fight back. And when her personal attacks didn't work, Patty took her campaign online because apparently harassing me in person and through City Hall just wasn't enough. She needed an audience. She created a Facebook group called Concerned Citizens of Sunset Ridge and began posting photos of my property with captions that would make a tabloid journalist blush. "Dangerous heavy equipment threatens children's safety," she wrote under a picture of my backhoe parked in my own driveway. "Industrial operation destroying residential property values," read another caption beneath a photo of my grandfather's barn, taken from the public road with a telephoto lens. The woman had missed her calling as a propaganda minister. But here's where Patty made another tactical error. She underestimated the intelligence of her own neighbors. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Not as a member because I wasn't one, but as an interested neighbor who wanted to understand what all the fuss was about. I sat quietly in the back of the community center, wearing my best jeans and a button-down shirt, taking notes and trying to blend in. What I witnessed was like watching a one-person show titled The Patty Thornfield Experience. She dominated every discussion, cut off anyone who disagreed with her, and made unilateral decisions while the other board members just nodded along like bobbleheads. But I noticed something else. 3 of the 5 board members looked uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable, especially when Patty began her presentation about undesirable elements threatening our community standards. After the meeting, as folks were filing out, a petite Asian woman in her 60s approached me. "You're the ranch owner she's been targeting," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Jake Morrison." I extended my hand. "Margaret Chen. I'm the HOA treasurer." She glanced around nervously. "Could we talk privately sometime? There are things you should know about the financial situation." Now that was interesting. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. When works for you? How about tomorrow morning? Rosie's Diner on Main Street, 8 a.m. The next morning, over coffee and eggs, Margaret Chen changed everything. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with trembling hands. "I've been treasurer for 3 years, and I've been seeing things that don't add up. Patricia has been making financial decisions without board approval, and when I ask questions, she shuts me down." "What kind of decisions?" I asked. "Large payments to consulting companies, landscape consulting, security services, administrative fees. But when I try to see the actual contracts or invoices, she says they're confidential vendor agreements." Margaret pulled out a small notebook. "Last year alone, we paid $89,000 in these consulting fees. But our actual landscaping costs should only be about $30,000, and we don't have any security services." I felt that familiar tingle you get when puzzle pieces start clicking together. "Mrs. Chen, have you ever heard of a company called TC Enterprises?" Her eyes widened. "That's one of the companies we've been paying." "How did you know?" "Lucky guess. What else can you tell me about the financial irregularities?" For the next hour, Margaret laid out a pattern of suspicious transactions that would make an accountant weep. Shell companies with names like TC Safety Solutions and TC Management Services, billing the HOA for services that were either never provided or grossly overpriced. Here's a knowledge nugget everyone needs to understand. HOAs are quasi-governmental organizations, which means their financial records are public documents. Any homeowner has the right to request detailed financial statements, and the HOA legally cannot refuse. But Margaret revealed something even more interesting. She's done this before. At her previous HOA in California, there were financial irregularities that resulted in her resignation. No charges were filed because they quietly paid restitution. I was starting to realize I wasn't dealing with just a petty tyrant. I was dealing with a serial HOA fraudster who'd moved to Texas to start fresh. Meanwhile, Patty's harassment campaign was escalating. My business insurance company called to inform me they were dropping my policy due to anonymous complaints about unsafe operations and hazardous material storage. Without insurance, I couldn't operate my business. Without my business, I couldn't afford to keep the ranch. The crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked to check on the horses that evening sounded different somehow. Heavier, more ominous. The familiar scent of hay and leather in the barn was now mixed with the bitter taste of financial stress. I could feel the rough wooden rails of the horse stalls under my palms, solid and real, while everything else in my life seemed to be shifting under my feet. But you know what? Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a man is having his back pushed against the wall. It clarifies things. It strips away everything except what really matters. Patty Thornfield thought she was close to victory. She thought she'd found the perfect pressure point, my livelihood, and that I'd fold like a cheap lawn chair. She was about to learn that there's a difference between a tactical retreat and surrender, and that sometimes the quiet guy in the back of the room is the most dangerous person in the building. Time to stop playing defense and start playing chess. That weekend, I did what any good engineer does when the scope of a problem becomes clear. I built a spreadsheet. Margaret had given me enough information to start digging, and what I found would have made a forensic accountant salivate. Using the Freedom of Information Act, yes, HOAs fall under public records laws, I requested 3 years of financial statements from Sunset Ridge HOA. Here's another knowledge nugget for you. Any homeowner can request HOA financial records, and they legally cannot refuse. They might try to stall or charge administrative fees, but public records are public records. What those records revealed was a masterclass in embezzlement. Over 3 years, the HOA had paid $86,000 to 3 companies. TC Enterprises for landscape consulting, TC Safety Solutions for security services, and TC Management Services for administrative consulting. The invoices were professional-looking, the amounts seemed reasonable when spread out over time, and the board had approved every payment, except for one small problem. All 3 companies were registered to the same address, Patricia Thornfield's address. TC stood for Thornfield Consulting. Patty had created 3 shell companies to systematically bill the HOA for services that either didn't exist or were grossly inflated. The landscape consulting fees were 3 times what the actual landscaper charged. The security services were for a neighborhood that had never had security issues. The administrative consulting was Patty literally paying herself to do the job she was already elected to do for free. But it got better. I cross-referenced the business registration dates with board meeting minutes and found that Patty had created each shell company immediately after joining the HOA board. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was premeditated. I spent Sunday afternoon researching her previous HOA in California. Sure enough, TC Enterprises had operated there too, billing that HOA for similar consulting services until financial irregularities forced Patty's resignation. No criminal charges were filed because the HOA board quietly accepted restitution to avoid bad publicity. Patty Thornfield wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a serial HOA fraudster who moved to Texas when California got too hot. Here's the legal reality. Embezzlement over $30,000 is a second-degree felony in Texas, punishable by 2 to 20 years in prison and up to $10,000 in fines. With $86,000 stolen, Patty was staring down serious time, but the civil exposure was even better. Texas allows triple damages for theft, meaning Patty could owe the HOA $258,000 plus attorney fees. Add in the harassment lawsuit I was building, and we were talking about enough money to buy her white Lexus several times over. I had her dead to rights. One phone call to the district attorney, and Patty's HOA reign would end in handcuffs. But that felt too easy, too quick. She'd spent months making my life hell, systematically harassing my neighbors and stealing from her community. She deserved a more educational experience. I wanted her to dig her own hole deeper. I wanted the entire community to see exactly who they'd been trusting with their money and their neighborhood. And most importantly, I wanted to make sure this never happened again. Not here. Not anywhere else Patty might land. So I made a decision my ex-wife would have called typically stubborn, and my old Army buddies would have recognized as tactical patience. Instead of ending this quickly, I was going to let Patty keep escalating until she hung herself with her own rope. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the victim reacting to her attacks. I was the prosecutor, building an airtight case. Every move she made from here on out would just add to the evidence pile. Patty thought she was close to victory, that she'd almost driven the troublesome rancher off his land. She had no idea her target had just become her biggest threat. The hunter had become the hunted. And the prey was about to start setting traps. Time to assemble my war council. My first call went to my Army buddy, Tom Rodriguez, not the deputy, a different Rodriguez. Tom had traded his combat engineer uniform for a law degree and now specialized in civil rights cases in Austin. When I laid out the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Jake," he finally said, "what you're describing isn't just harassment. It's systematic civil rights violations with a clear pattern of discrimination. The fact that she's targeting minorities and veterans elevates this to federal territory." "What are we talking about legally?" I asked. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Conspiracy to violate civil rights. Potential RICO charges if we can prove the financial crimes are part of an ongoing criminal enterprise." Tom's voice took on that same edge it used to have when he was planning demolitions. "Plus, she's using her position of authority to harass people based on protected characteristics. That's textbook Section 1983 violation. Here's a knowledge nugget that could save your life someday. When government officials, or people acting under government, authority systematically harass citizens, it becomes a federal civil rights case under 42 U.S.C., Section 1983. The damages can be enormous, and the defendants can be held personally liable. Next, I needed technical support. My nephew Kevin had just finished his cybersecurity degree and was looking for real-world experience. The kid was a wizard with computers and had more patience for documentation than anyone his age should. "Uncle Jake," he said when I explained the situation, "you need professional-grade evidence collection, not just security cameras. We're talking encrypted backups, social media monitoring, digital forensics. If this goes to court, every piece of evidence needs to be bulletproof." Within a week, Kevin had transformed my property into a surveillance fortress. Hidden cameras with night vision, audio recording, automatic cloud backup, even a system that tracked when Patty's white Lexus passed my driveway. The kid was thorough, but the most important ally came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice shaking. "Mr. Morrison, I've been going through more financial records." "It's worse than I thought, much worse." We met again at Rosie's Diner, but this time Margaret brought a cardboard box full of documents. "I've been secretly copying everything for months. Bank statements, vendor contracts, board resolutions. Patricia's been forging signatures on checks, approving payments without board votes, even transferring money between accounts without authorization." "How much are we talking about total?" I asked. "Over 3 years, nearly $180,000. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured cream into her coffee. "She's been stealing from us for so long it's become normal. The other board members just sign whatever she puts in front of them." I realized Margaret wasn't just an ally. She was a whistleblower, putting herself at considerable risk. "Mrs. Chen, what you're doing takes courage," I said. "But you need to know, once we pull this trigger, there's no going back." "Mr. Morrison, I've been watching her destroy this community for 3 years. She's turned neighbors against each other, driven good people away, and stolen money that was supposed to make our neighborhood better. It has to stop." That's when I knew we had everything we needed. Tom came down from Austin the following weekend to review our evidence. Watching him work was like watching a master craftsman. He organized everything into timelines, cross-referenced the harassment incidents with the financial crimes, and built a case tighter than a submarine. "This is prosecution-level work," he said, leaning back in my kitchen chair. "We've got her on embezzlement, civil rights violations, conspiracy, fraud, false police reports, and about 6 other charges. But here's the beautiful part. We can file both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits simultaneously. What's that mean in practical terms? I asked. Criminal case puts her in prison. Civil case takes every asset she has and gives it back to the people she stole from. We're talking about complete financial destruction. But I wanted more than punishment. I wanted prevention. Tom, what happens to stop her from just moving to another state and doing this again? That's where the RICO charges come in, he said. If we can prove this is an ongoing criminal enterprise, and we can, she gets flagged in a national database. No HOA in America will be able to hire her without knowing her history. Meanwhile, I quietly reached out to Patty's other victims. The Ramirez family was eager to testify about years of harassment disguised as code enforcement. Sarah Mitchell had kept recordings of Patty's abusive phone calls. Bill Thompson, the Vietnam vet, had documented every false complaint filed against him. We weren't just building a case anymore, we were building a movement. The final piece came together when Kevin discovered Patty's private Facebook messages. She'd been coordinating her harassment campaign through social media, recruiting neighbors to file false complaints, even offering to compensate people for their cooperation. Uncle Jake, Kevin said, showing me his laptop screen, she basically documented her entire conspiracy in writing. It's like she wanted to get caught. Everything was ready. We had overwhelming evidence, multiple victims willing to testify, and a legal strategy that would end Patty's reign permanently. All we needed now was the perfect stage for her final performance. While I was busy building my case, Patty was busy losing her mind, and desperate people make desperate choices. It all began on a Tuesday night. Around 3 a.m., the harsh shriek of metal grinding against metal jolted me awake, a sound that makes any equipment owner's heart drop. Grabbing my flashlight, I rushed to the workshop. What I saw made my hands tremble with fury. My excavator had been sabotaged. Someone had poured sugar into the gas tank, sliced through the hydraulic lines, and for good measure dumped sand straight into the oil reservoir. The damage? At least $8,000 in repairs. My business was effectively shut down until I could rebuild what had been destroyed. But there was one thing Patty didn't count on: Kevin's surveillance system. The cameras caught everything. Crystal-clear footage showed a white Lexus SUV pulling up at 2:47 a.m., and there she was, Patricia Thornfield herself, stepping out with a toolbox and a bag of sugar. For 45 minutes, she methodically tore through my equipment, completely unaware that the infrared cameras were recording her every move. At sunrise, I called Deputy Rodriguez. "Deputy, I need to file a report for destruction of property, and this time, I've got video evidence." When he watched the footage, his professional calm shifted to open anger. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "this isn't just vandalism. Destruction of property over $2,500 is a state jail felony, and what she did here looks more like aggravated criminal mischief." I asked what that meant for her. 2 years in state jail, up to a $10,000 fine, and restitution for damages. And now that we have her on video, this changes everything. But Patty wasn't finished revealing who she really was. 3 days later, my insurance agent called, sounding rattled. "Jake," he said, "I just had the strangest call. A woman named Patricia Thornfield contacted our office claiming she could mediate your situation if we canceled your coverage. Said she represented the community and could make your problems disappear if we dropped you as a client." I couldn't help but laugh. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that interfering with someone's insurance is insurance fraud, a federal offense, and then I reported the call to our fraud investigation unit." With that, Patty had just added federal mail fraud and insurance interference to her growing list of crimes. She'd become a one-woman crime wave. Meanwhile, Kevin had been keeping an eye on her social media, and what he uncovered was pure gold. Patty was running a coordinated harassment campaign through private Facebook messages, recruiting neighbors to file false complaints, and even offering to pay their HOA dues in exchange for cooperation. Uncle Jake, "Look at this," Kevin said, holding up screenshots. "She's literally paying people to lie to city inspectors. And she documented everything." The messages read like the blueprint of a conspiracy. "If everyone calls code enforcement about the same violation, they'll have to act," she told one neighbor. "I'll cover your HOA fees for 6 months if you file a complaint about the noise." The most incriminating message, though, was to her husband. The insurance thing worked. His business is basically shut down. A few more pressure points and he'll have to sell. It was conspiracy in writing, clear intent to cause financial harm, and then the cracks began to show. Neighbors started reporting her erratic behavior, screaming at city officials on the phone, public confrontations at the grocery store, and paranoid social media rants about outside agitators destroying the community. Margaret, who still attended HOA meetings, called me one evening. "She's losing it, Mr. Morrison. Yesterday she accused me of being a spy for anti-HOA extremists. Now she's demanding emergency powers to deal with what she calls the Jake Morrison crisis." "Emergency powers?" I repeated. "She wants authority to place immediate liens on properties, hire private security, and override board votes. The rest of the members are terrified of her." That's when I knew Patty was about to overreach, and that overreach would destroy her. At our next coffee meeting, Margaret confirmed it. "She's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. The agenda says, addressing immediate security threats to community welfare. She's about to formalize her harassment campaign as HOA policy. Perfect. She was about to create a paper trail that would tie her crimes directly to the HOA itself." "Mrs. Chen," I asked, "are you ready to record the meeting?" She nodded grimly. "I've been recording since our first talk. If she's going to burn this place down, at least there'll be proof." Patty Thornfield was about to step from individual criminal to ringleader of an organized conspiracy, and she'd do it publicly, on the record, with Margaret capturing every word. Sometimes the best plan is to let your enemy hang themselves with their own rope. The emergency board meeting went exactly as expected. According to Margaret's recording, Patty presented what she called the Morrison Threat Assessment, a full PowerPoint presentation, complete with aerial photos of my land, financial projections of declining property values, and an action plan fit for a dictator. "We need immediate authority to place liens on non-compliant properties," she declared. "The legal precedent is clear. HOAs have eminent domain powers that supersede individual property rights." That, of course, was completely false. HOAs have no eminent domain powers, and hers certainly had no jurisdiction over my property. Then came the question that shattered her illusion. Board member David Walsh raised his hand. "Patricia, is this property even within our HOA boundaries?" Her answer was breathtaking. Boundaries are fluid when community welfare is at stake. Legal technicalities shouldn't stop us from protecting property values. Margaret's audio captured the heavy silence that followed. Even Patty's most loyal board members weren't willing to endorse theft and extortion dressed up as civic duty, but she still wasn't done. The next morning, I woke to find official-looking documents zip-tied to my gate. Notice of immediate lien, Sunset Ridge HOA. According to the paperwork, my property now carried a $15,000 lien for accumulated violations and administrative fees. The document was signed by none other than Patricia Thornfield, HOA president, and it came with a deadline. Payment or property transfer was demanded within 30 days to avoid foreclosure proceedings. I had to hand it to her. Patty had nerve. The woman had just attempted to steal my ranch using forged legal documents. I called Tom immediately. "She did what?" he barked after I read him the lien notice. "That's attempted extortion using fraudulent legal filings," he said grimly. "In Texas, that qualifies as organized criminal activity under the RICO statute." "In plain English, Tom, what does that mean?" I asked. "It means she just graduated from small-time crook to federal offender. RICO charges carry up to 20 years in prison and complete asset forfeiture. She's just bet her house on a bluff." But Patty's desperation had reached a dangerous peak. That afternoon, my daughter Emma called from college, her voice trembling. "Dad, someone just called my dorm claiming to be from the county sheriff's office," she said. "They said you were under investigation for environmental crimes and needed to verify my contact info for when you're arrested." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Targeting me was one thing. Dragging my daughter into it crossed every line imaginable. I immediately called Deputy Rodriguez. "Someone impersonated a law enforcement officer to harass my daughter at school," I told him. "I want to file a formal complaint." "Mr. Morrison," he replied, Impersonating a peace officer is a third-degree felony in Texas. If we can prove who made that call, they're looking at real prison time. Once again, Kevin's tech skills saved the day. He traced the call straight back to Patty's home phone. She'd been so rattled she forgot to block her number or use a burner. We had her dead to rights. Felony impersonation of a peace officer. The final straw came that weekend. I was having dinner with Sarah Mitchell, the single mother Patty had been harassing, and her teenage son, Marcus. Sarah had been helping me document the harassment, and we'd grown close during the investigation. We were sitting on my porch watching the sunset when 3 pickup trucks rolled up my driveway. Men I'd never seen before climbed out, each holding signs that read, "Respect property values. Stop the harassment." Their leader, a man in his 50s wearing a Sunset Ridge HOA polo, marched up the porch. "Mr. Morrison, we're here representing the community," he said. "Mrs. Thornfield sent us to discuss your compliance issues." I stood slowly as Sarah pulled Marcus behind her. "Gentlemen," I said evenly, "you're on private property. You need to leave." "We're not leaving until you agree to stop harassing our HOA president," the man replied. His crew spread out across my yard in a deliberate show of force. That's when I smiled, because Kevin's cameras were recording everything. And what these men didn't realize was that group intimidation like this qualified as criminal conspiracy under Texas law. "Sarah," I said calmly, "would you mind calling Deputy Rodriguez? Tell him we've got a situation that needs immediate attention. The crunch of gravel under boots, the smell of cigarette smoke and exhaust, the surge of adrenaline steadying my hands. It all brought back memories from my Army days. The difference was this time the law was completely on my side. "You know what, fellas?" I said, still smiling. "Mrs. Thornfield made a serious tactical error sending you here. Because now she's not just guilty of individual crimes, she's orchestrated a criminal conspiracy." Sirens wailed in the distance, and the men's confidence began to crumble. Patty had just promoted herself from lone criminal to conspiracy ringleader, and she'd done it on camera with witnesses. By the following Tuesday, the night of the annual HOA meeting, word had spread. The community center overflowed with more than 200 homeowners, the biggest turnout in Sunset Ridge history. Margaret had tipped off the local paper, and I'd invited Deputy Rodriguez to attend as a community liaison. Patty arrived in her white Lexus, looking like she was heading to a corporate board meeting. Perfect hair, designer suit, and a briefcase likely full of more fraudulent documents. She had no idea she was walking into her own public execution. I sat quietly in the back with my accordion file of evidence, watching her charm the crowd like a politician. "Tonight," she began confidently, "we're going to address the security threats plaguing our community. It's time to take back our neighborhood." The irony was exquisite. Margaret Chen stood up to deliver the treasurer's report, and that's when things turned. "Before we discuss new business," Margaret said firmly, "the community deserves transparency about where its money has been going." Patty tried to shut her down. "Mrs. Chen, we have a set agenda tonight." "The agenda includes the treasurer's report," Margaret replied, unshaken. "And I have some concerning findings to share." I watched Patty's face tighten as Margaret projected the financial statements on the screen. 3 years of payments to TC Enterprises, TC Safety Solutions, and TC Management Services, $180,000 in questionable transactions. All shell companies registered to Patricia Thornfield's home address. A murmur swept through the crowd like distant thunder. "Our assessment money went to her companies?" someone shouted. "This is character assassination," Patty screamed, leaping to her feet and pointing at Margaret. "This woman is conspiring with outsiders to destroy our community." That's when I stood up. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said evenly, "my name is Jake Morrison. I think we need to talk." The room fell dead silent. Everyone had heard about the problem rancher, but few had seen me before. "You're not a member of this HOA," Patty snapped. "You have no right to be here." "You're absolutely right," I said, pulling out my property records. "I'm not a member, never have been, never will be. But you've been harassing me for months, filing false police reports and trying to steal my land with fraudulent liens." I walked to the front as Deputy Rodriguez stepped forward to stand beside me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The law was literally on my side. For 6 months, I continued, Mrs. Thornfield has waged a systematic campaign of harassment against me and others. She's filed false complaints, trespassed on my property, sabotaged my equipment, and even targeted my college-aged daughter with threatening calls. The room was silent, utterly still. But here's what breaks my heart, I said quietly, scanning the crowd. She's stolen nearly $200,000 from this community through fake consulting companies. Money meant to improve your neighborhood went straight into her personal accounts. Patty began frantically shoving papers into her briefcase. I don't have to listen to these lies, she shouted. Ma'am, I began calmly, these aren't lies. I turned toward the deputy. Deputy Rodriguez, would you like to explain what the sheriff's department uncovered? Rodriguez stepped forward, a folder in his hand. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, we have video proof of you committing felony destruction of property, falsifying police reports, and impersonating a peace officer. We've also found evidence of organized criminal activity and conspiracy. The room exploded into chaos, angry shouts, shocked board members demanding answers, and Patty standing there frozen like a deer in headlights. But I wasn't finished. This was my moment. Mrs. Thornfield, I said, my voice carrying over the uproar. I served 20 years in the Army protecting communities like this one. I never imagined the greatest threat would come from someone claiming to serve it. Then I faced the crowd directly. You trusted her, with your money, your neighborhood, your way of life. And she betrayed that trust by stealing from you and terrorizing anyone who didn't fit her standards. A newspaper reporter scribbled notes as phones recorded from every corner of the room. I continued. But here's what matters most. This community is stronger than one person's greed and prejudice. You've got good people here, like Margaret Chen, who risked everything to tell the truth. You've got neighbors who care about each other. Don't let one criminal make you forget that. That's when it happened, the moment I'll never forget. Sarah Mitchell, the single mother Patty had tormented, stood and began to clap. Then Bill Thompson, the Vietnam vet. Then the Ramirez family. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding, while Patty Thornfield stood motionless at the front. Deputy Rodriguez stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, you're under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of filing false police reports. As they led her out, she turned back, shouting, You've destroyed everything! No, ma'am, I replied evenly. I just helped your neighbors see who you really are. The truth was out. Justice had arrived. Healing could finally begin, 6 months later. Patricia Thornfield was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay $540,000 in restitution, triple damages under Texas theft statutes. Her husband filed for divorce and lost his city job. The white Lexus? Sold at auction to repay the people she stole from, but the real victory wasn't her imprisonment. It was watching Sunset Ridge become the community it was meant to be. Margaret Chen was unanimously elected HOA president. Her first act, total financial transparency. Monthly reports now go online. Every expense needs 3 board approvals, and shell company billing is banned by bylaw. The harassment complaint system I helped design became a model across Texas. Any resident can file a complaint, and every case gets a full investigation and public hearing. No more secret tribunals. No more vendettas disguised as community standards. Property values rose after Patty's removal, proof that stability and trust are worth more than fear and control. As for the neighbors Patty bullied, they're thriving. The Ramirez family launched a landscaping business serving half the neighborhood. Sarah Mitchell finished nursing school and bought a bigger home. Bill Thompson still parks his RV in the driveway, and now neighbors stop by to hear his war stories. The best part? I used part of my settlement money to build something lasting, the Sunset Ridge Community Workshop. It's a 2,400-square-foot building at the back of my property, stocked with everything from wrenches to welding gear. Every Saturday morning, I teach neighbors how to use tools safely. Veterans get priority, and kids learn mechanical basics. We've built playground sets for the school, repaired neighbors' vehicles, and even built a gazebo for the community center. That workshop became the heart of something Patty never understood: real community cooperation. The monthly Fix-It clinic draws folks from 3 counties. Seniors bring broken appliances, young families learn home repair, and teenagers discover that working with their hands beats scrolling on screens. Last month alone, we saved 47 items from the landfill. And personally, life's never been better. Sarah Mitchell and I were married last spring, right here on the ranch. Her son, Marcus, calls me the stepdad who fought City Hall and won, and he's becoming quite the mechanic. My daughter, Emma, transferred to a Texas university to be closer to us. The ranch is more alive than it's been since my grandfather's day. 3 horses, 2 dogs, a barn cat named Deputy, after Rodriguez, and a garden that feeds half the neighborhood. But here's what I want you to take away from all this. Documentation beats confrontation, every time. I could have fought Patty head-on from day one, but patience and evidence brought me a victory that lasted. When someone tries to bully you, don't get angry. Get strategic. Know your rights. Property records? Public HOA financials? Public abuse of power? Federal law can stop it. Knowledge is power, and power used wisely protects communities. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a disabled Marine in California. His HOA is threatening foreclosure over fabricated violations and demanding he remove his service dog. Sound familiar? I told him exactly what I'm telling you. Gather evidence, learn the law, find allies, and never let bullies win. Sometimes the best way to protect your property is to help others protect theirs. So if you've got your own HOA horror story, drop it in the comments. Share your wins, your struggles, your lessons. This community doesn't end with this video, and hit that subscribe button, because next week, we're heading to California to help that Marine defend his home. Patty Thornfield may be behind bars, but plenty of petty tyrants remain. It's time they learned that Americans don't back down from bullies. As my grandfather used to say, good fences make good neighbors, but good neighbors make great communities. Welcome to the neighborhood.